In July of 1878, four men met at Israel Brandt's Tavern in the north of Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, and took out insurance on the life of a neighbor named Joseph Raber. 5 months later, two hired men walked the old man onto a plank over Indiantown Creek and held him under the water until he was dead. Raber was about 60. He lived up on the mountain in an abandoned charcoal burner's hut on a dirt floor under a ceiling too low for a grown man to stand upright in. He shared it with Polly Kreiser, a woman the neighbors called his housekeeper. He took farm work when the season allowed. The rest of the year, he lived on what the Gap could spare him, which was very little. The four men were his neighbors. They went into Lebanon with an insurance agent named George Schweinhard, whose office stood near the depot on 8th Street, and told him they had agreed to look after Joseph Raber for the rest of his life, and to see him decently buried when he died. Raber was brought along. He consented to all of it. He had been told that he would never again want for the necessaries of life. None of this was against the law. In Pennsylvania that year, a man could buy a policy on the life of someone he had no legal interest in whatever. It was done openly, at a desk, with a receipt. Within a fortnight, most of the Gap knew who held paper on old Joe Raber. Within 2 years, 5 men would hang in the yard of the Lebanon County Jail for the policies signed that summer. A 6th would walk out of the courthouse and go home. Sometime that autumn, they sent Joseph Raber to be examined by a doctor. There was a company in Baltimore they wanted to add to the list, and the company wanted to see the man first. So the old man from the charcoal burner's hut was brought down and looked over by a physician, the way a horse is looked over before a sale. He did not pass. Raber would not do, Henry Wise said of it a year later, under oath. He went on as he had before. He walked down to the store when he needed flour. He took a day's work in the fields when the season and his body allowed it. The Gap fed him because he had always been there. The Reading Times, describing him after everything was finished, called him a temperate man. He was old, and he was well. That was the difficulty. The policies written on him were of a kind sold all over the county at the time, known in plain speech as graveyard insurance. A man paid to join a pool of the living. Each time a member of that pool died, everyone still breathing was assessed a sum, which went to whoever held the dead man's paper. It rewarded whoever went into the ground first. Josiah Hummel, a laborer with no trade and no children, held $2,000 on him. So did George Zeckman. Brandt and Wise held policies of their own, scattered across half the insurance offices of the East. One county newspaper would put the whole of it at $13,000 and upwards. Nobody ever wrote down what Raber made of any of this. The notices kept coming through the autumn. The four men kept paying. By the end of that autumn, they were talking about how to hurry it. They talked at Brandt's place, a hotel and tavern at St. Joseph's Spring that had no license. Witnesses would later put them there together on more occasions than any of them cared to admit in court. The first plan was fishing. There was a dam at Kitzmiller's. The notion was to take the old man out on a flat and put him over the side. The difficulty was getting him to come. By Henry Wise's testimony a year afterward, George Zeckman was untroubled by that part of it. He had old Joe in a good tune, he said. All it would take was a word about his wife being hungry for fish. Wise also swore to the one instruction they had all agreed on. The old man must not be marked. Brandt had a refinement. Somebody would tip the flat, then jump in and haul Raber out, so that the whole thing would read as a rescue that came too late. They offered a young man in the neighborhood $100 to play the rescuer. He said no, and was told what would happen if he ever repeated the conversation. What Charles Drews was to be paid changed with every telling. $300 from Brant, with the same again from each of the others once the work was done. $1,500, according to what Drews told his own wife, who answered that the men who hired him would probably cheat him. They took Joseph Raber out to Kitzmiller's Dam in the late autumn. The flat lay submerged when they got there. The old man said he was too cold to fish, so they all came home. Joseph Peters had married Charles Drews' daughter Lena, and that winter the two of them were living in her father's house, a few hundred yards up from the creek. Peters was in the army, or had been. He came home on leave and did not go back when he was supposed to. There was talk in the Gap about why he stayed on. The talk was that his wife had been seeing Frank Stickler, a laborer of 19, while he was away. Drews came to his son-in-law while Peters was chopping wood on the mountain. There was a nice pile of money to be had, he said, with no great difficulty about it. Brant had offered him $500 to put the old man out of the way. He had agreed to do it, but he wanted help. Peters said no. Drews told him that if he repeated a word of it, he would be shot. He was the third man in that neighborhood to be asked, and the third to be threatened. Not one of the three went to a constable. Peters went on living in the house of the man who had asked him. On the Sunday before it happened, the arithmetic ran out. The last premium on one of the policies was nearly due. George Zeckman, by Wise's account, sent word that the old man was to be worked out of the way before the coming Saturday. If it was not done by then, Zeckman said, he would sell his policy to another man in the county, because he could not pay the assessments any longer. 6 days. Saturday, the 7th of December, 1878. Charles Drews called at Raber's hut more than once that day. In the late afternoon, he got the old man to come down to his own house, and there the errand was settled. Raber wanted flour. Drews said there was tobacco in it for him as well, that they would walk over to Kreiser's store together and get both. Upstairs, Joseph Peters heard the talk through the floor. He had been drinking that afternoon. His wife was with him. Through the boards came Drews asking the old man about tobacco. Then the sound of Frank Stickler arriving. Then the three of them going out. Peters got up and went to the window. The window looked out over a cornfield. Past it ran the creek. 2 planks laid side by side served as the bridge, and there was nothing else to walk on for some distance either way. Peters watched the 3 men cross the field in single file. By his account, Stickler went first, Raber second, Drews last. When they reached the middle of the water, Stickler turned around, took hold of the old man, knocked his feet from under him, and put him into the creek. Peters stepped away from the window. He waited. Some time later he looked out again. 2 men were coming back through the corn. He went downstairs with his wife. The whole family was in the room. Stickler was pulling off his wet clothes while Drews handed him dry ones of his own, asking that the wet things be hung out of sight in case anybody came to the house. Later that evening, in front of them all, Stickler asked Drews whether it was true that old Raber had drowned. They had the conversation for the benefit of the room. Drews said he had seen the old man fall in, that by the time he reached him, it was over. Nobody went into the water after him. He was taken out of the creek later. Nobody tried to bring him round. Around dusk, Drews went down to the tavern at Brant's hotel and told the men drinking there that Joe Raber was dead. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Israel Brant rode into Lebanon to fetch the coroner. The next morning, the neighbors would not let the body into their houses. The coroner had come up from Lebanon and had to hold his inquest somewhere, so he held it in a barn. A jury of local men looked the old man over. They found nothing on him. No bruise, no cut, no mark of any kind. Charles Drews gave his account. He had seen Raber fall from the plank, he said, and by the time he got to him, it was over. Several other people supported what Drews said. Every man on that jury lived within a few miles of the 4 men who held paper on the dead man. It was a small neighborhood, and the newspapers were able to print the figures within the week. The verdict was written down in the language of the day. Rayber had fallen from a plank while crossing Indiantown Creek, overcome by an attack of vertigo. He was buried out of one of the churches in Union Township, and his grave was made at the Moonshine Cemetery. The Philadelphia Inquirer carried it the next day as one line of telegraph news. A man in Union Township, taken with vertigo, fallen into Indiantown River, drowned. The Lebanon Daily News took a different tone. The neighborhood Brant had ridden in from was not celebrated for the moral character of its inhabitants, the paper said. There had been a great deal of comment when it became understood that Rayber was heavily insured, and that the chief amounts on his policies were held by residents of that same neighborhood. The Lebanon Courier put it plainer still. Persons in the vicinity held policies on Rayber's life for $13,000 and upwards, the Courier told its readers, and there was unpleasant talk about the probability of his death not being accidental. Death proofs were drawn up in the presence of the men who held the paper. The claims went into the companies. The companies did not pay. For the next 2 months, nothing happened in Lebanon County except talk. The insurance men were not talking, they were working. Their investigators came up into the Gap in January, going from house to house, and were still at it in February. In the Drews house, the arrangement had broken down. Charles Drews had been keeping his daughter and her husband under his roof, feeding them both. That winter, he stopped. He put them out. On the 4th of February, Joseph Peters swore out an affidavit before a justice of the peace, charging 6 men with the murder of Joseph Rayber, his own father-in-law among them. All 6 were in custody by that afternoon. In April, a grand jury indicted every one of them together. The county read about the arrests in the papers and was reported to be stunned. A good many of its people had known for months. Then there was the matter of who had brought the charge. Peters was the man Drews had approached first, on the mountain. By one sworn account, he had also gone along on the failed trip to Kitzmiller's Dam, which he denied with force from the witness stand. And there was the small arithmetic of his silence. When the body was brought out of the creek, he stood among 50 or so people and said nothing. He sat through the inquest in the barn and said nothing. He went to the funeral and said nothing. 2 months later, within days of being put out of the house, he went to the justice of the peace. Whether it was conscience, or the fear of being charged himself, or the eviction, the record does not settle. 3 sets of lawyers argued it for a week, and the county has argued it ever since. So we will put it to you, because you now know as much about Joseph Peters as the jury did. Conscience, fear, or the house. Leave the one you believe in the comments, and keep it in mind, because you are about to hear him cross-examined for a day by a man who wanted the same answer. Lena Peters was subpoenaed to say what she had seen from the upstairs window of her father's house. The window was standing in the courtroom. Somebody had taken the sash out of the wall of the Drews house and carried it into Lebanon. Through the 2nd and 3rd weeks of April 1879, it stood among the tables while 9 lawyers argued about what could be seen through it. The gallery was full every day. Most of the testimony was given in German, translated as it went. On the first day, one of the reporters looked along the row of prisoners and noticed that all 6 had blue eyes. He put it in his copy. Within a week, the name had gone around the world. Lena Peters took the stand and gave her evidence in German. She was the daughter of one prisoner, the wife of the man whose word would hang him. She sat facing her father, who was placed in the circle of the defense, directly opposite her. A correspondent who watched them both wrote that the resemblance between them was striking, and that their eyes never once met. Drews spent the time talking with his counsel. His daughter looked at the floor. He called her a very good witness and noted the coolness with which she gave the most damaging evidence in the room. Her account matched her husband's in everything except the drowning itself, which she had not seen. Then, partway through, her feelings overcame her and she broke into violent weeping. She got herself back in hand with difficulty and went on answering. Her husband had the harder day. William Durr, who was defending Zeckman, took Joseph Peters on cross-examination and kept him there. The drinking came out first, then the desertion, which Peters would not call by that name. Then the 50 people at the creek, the inquest, the funeral, and not a word said at any of them. Then the eviction, and the admission that he had gone to the justice only after Drews put him out. Durr asked him why. Peters said he had been afraid for his life. Drews and Stickler had told him that if he spoke, he would be shot. That answer decided the case. In his closing, Grant Weidman for the Commonwealth turned the defense around. A man in that neighborhood had every reason to keep his mouth shut. "You recollect Schuylkill County's reign of terror," Weidman said to the jury. "All were afraid over there. No one dared to speak. The Molly Maguire hangings were 2 years old, and every man in that box knew what he meant." Colonel Gobin spoke 2 hours for the defense. He denounced the insurance companies for trying to hang 5 poor men to save their money. He called Joseph Peters a coward who would swear 6 men into their graves. Not one of the 6 took the stand. The case rested on 2 witnesses, husband and wife, out of the same house as the man in the dock. 2 men crossed that plank ahead of Joseph Raber and behind him. Both of them swore to it afterward. Their accounts do not fit together. Peters had testified to what he saw from the window. Stickler in front, the old man in the middle, Drews at the rear. At the middle of the stream, Stickler turned, took Raber by the shoulders, knocked his feet out from under him, put him in. Charles Drews wrote his own account in German, in the county jail, for the Lebanon Daily News. He asked that it not be printed until after he was hanged. "I went first," Drews wrote, "Raber second, and Stickler third. And when they came to the water, Stickler took Raber by the legs and threw him in and held him down until his life was extinct." Drews said he himself went back to the fence. One of the 2 men in that procession confessed that he was walking in front. The one eyewitness swore he was walking behind. The defense had a third account, which needed neither man. The bed of the creek was stone, they said, and the old man had struck his head going in. The Commonwealth answered with neighbors who had known that stream all their lives. The bottom there had always been sand and mud. Then came the accounts the condemned men gave against each other. Drews put the drowning on Stickler. Stickler agreed about all of it, except that Drews had helped him hold the old man under. Brandt denied the plot altogether. Hummel said he had simply bought a policy from Wise, an innocent thing, commonplace in that county. There was one account nobody revised, and it came from the men themselves before any of them were arrested. About a week after the drowning, Stickler was at Drews' house again, and in front of the family, the 2 of them talked boldly about what they had done. It had taken the pair of them, they said, because the old man had gone hard. That was the version nobody disputed. The courthouse bell rang about 5 hours after the jury went out. The verdict was guilty of murder in the first degree, returned against all 6 men at once, which, as far as the local paper could establish, had never happened before in the history of the common law. The defense asked that the jury be polled. Each juror was asked about each prisoner in turn. The word guilty was spoken in that room 72 times, 12 of them over George Zeckman. At sentencing, the judge asked each man whether he had anything to say. Israel Brandt said, "Not now," but that when the time came, he would tell. Frank Stickler said it loudly and angrily that he was not guilty and had not got justice in that place. 4 of them were sentenced to hang. Henry Wise was not sentenced that day because 2 days earlier he had written out a confession of 32 pages for the attorneys of the Commonwealth in exchange for testifying against Zeckman. Zeckman was not sentenced either. The judge granted him a new trial. Against the other 5, there had been witnesses, confessions, a man at a window. Against Zeckman, there was only what his co-defendants said, which could not be used once he stood alone. So in November, he went back into the same courtroom by himself. The Commonwealth had Wise this time. On the stand, he rambled until the judge and the lawyers agreed among themselves that they were all at sea in it. What he got across was that Zeckman had come to him first about insuring the old man, and had told him the law would not touch anyone except the man who did the killing. The only other person he had ever insured, Wise said, was his mother. Zeckman had a policy on his own mother as well. He had bought paper on several lives around the Gap over the years, and every one of those people was still living. That was his defense, and it was a good one, because it was true. He was a laborer with 6 children, the eldest of them 8, who had bought insurance on a poor man's life the way half the county had. The jury stayed out all night. In the morning, the foreman said not guilty, and George Zeckman walked out of the courthouse into a town that did not believe a word of it. The next morning, they hanged Charles Drews and Frank Stickler. The evening before the first hanging, a boy of about 12 came into the sheriff's office in Lebanon with a quarter in his hand. He had heard that tickets to the execution were selling for 25 cents. He wanted one. The deputy put him out into the street. 150 tickets were issued all the same. It rained lightly on the morning of the 14th of November, 1879. 4 ministers came to the jail at 9 to sit with the 2 men. Drews sang and prayed, loud enough to be heard through the cell block, then went round to say goodbye to the other prisoners. The hired executioner had come over from Harrisburg. He interrupted the prayers to measure both men for the drop. At 11:15, the sheriff called down the block that it was time. The prayers at the scaffold were in German. The courthouse clock began to strike 11, while the assembly was in the middle of the Lord's Prayer, and the pace of it quickened. A last blessing was said in English. The sheriff strapped their arms, put the ropes on, drew the white hoods down. Just before the trap went, Drews called out to the younger man beside him. "Frank," he said, "now we go to heaven." The bodies were put into plain coffins supplied by the directors of the poor. Stickler's people took him home and buried him in the family ground. 6 months later, it was the turn of the other 3. A week before the date, Brandt and Hummel bored through their cell wall, got as far as the jail yard, which was walled and overlooked, and were back in separate cells within minutes. On the 13th of May, 8th Street filled up with men, women, and children from all over the county. Inside, a local tailor had made the 3 of them new suits, and a woman of Lebanon sent small bouquets, which were pinned to their coats. Henry Wise sent word that he wanted to go out first, to speak before the other 2 were brought out. The sheriff allowed it. Wise went up the steps quickly and turned to face the crowd. All of them were guilty, he said in German, exactly as he had testified and confessed. That was all he had to say. Brandt and Hummel were brought out and asked whether they wanted to speak. Neither did. The 3 knelt on the trap while a minister read to them. Then the yard was cleared and the sheriff sprang it. Israel Brandt had promised the court that when the time came, he would tell. His statement was already written, sealed, and lodged, with instructions that it be opened 1 year after his death. Not $1 was ever paid out on the life of Joseph Raber. The proofs of death were drawn up properly, in the presence of the men who held the paper and sent in within days of the drowning. Nothing came back. The whole enterprise cost the 4 beneficiaries their assessments, their liberty, and in 4 cases, their lives. What it did change was the paper itself. Insuring the life of a person in whom the buyer had no legal interest was written out of the business over the years that followed. That was the lasting result of Joseph Raber's death. It was a reform of insurance law. George Zeckman came out of the county jail with a cough he never lost. He died in Union Township in 1887 of consumption, 7 years after the men he was tried with. Joseph Peters died of the same disease, and said in his last years that the 5 dead men came to him, that he had been bewitched by them. Lena Peters testified, and finished answering the questions of what became of her afterward, and of Polly Kreiser, who had kept house in the hut on the mountain. Nothing further was written down. The 6 men lie in 4 different burial grounds around Lebanon County. Joseph Raber lies at the Moonshine Cemetery. His stone is still there. He was about 60 when they insured him. 4 companies had a figure for what his life was worth, and the men who paid the premiums told him he would never want for the necessaries of life again. They kept that promise for 5 months. No photograph of him was ever taken. No one ever drew him.